What if the greatest figure humanity ever produced never rose above humanity itself, never became distant, untouchable, or absolute, but instead remained something far more dangerous and far more fragile, a man who could age, doubt, hesitate, and eventually fail? In the darkness of the 41st millennium, the Emperor is remembered as an eternal presence, locked into survival by machines, sustained by endless sacrifice, and transformed into an idea rather than a living will. But history rarely asks the more unsettling question of what the galaxy would look like if that transformation never happened. Imagine a future where the Emperor remained mortal, not weakened, not diminished, but bound by time, consequence, and irreversible choice, forced to lead not as a symbol carved into stone, but as a living mind navigating an empire that was never designed to be ruled by anyone forever. This single divergence reshapes everything, from the Great Crusade to the fate of the Primarchs, from the structure of the Imperium to the very way humanity confronts the endless hostility of the galaxy. A mortal emperor does not inspire blind permanence. Instead, he creates momentum, urgency, and the terrifying reality that leadership must eventually be passed on, questioned, and possibly undone. This is not a story about divinity or destiny. It is a story about power under limitation, about a future where humanity's greatest protector must confront the same fear that defines every civilization, the knowledge that no ruler lasts forever, and that survival depends not on worship or myth, but on preparation, adaptability, and trust. With mortality comes a radically different approach to leadership, because a ruler who knows his time is finite plans differently than one who believes himself permanent. The Emperor, still possessing unmatched intellect and strategic foresight, would no longer build systems designed to function around his eternal presence, but instead construct institutions capable of surviving his absence. The Great Crusade would still ignite across the stars, but its purpose subtly shifts from absolute unification to controlled expansion, with long-term stability valued over rapid conquest. Compliance is no longer enforced purely through overwhelming force, but through negotiated integration, infrastructure development, and shared command structures that allow planetary systems to govern themselves while remaining aligned with a greater human vision. The Imperium becomes less centralized around one mind and more distributed across councils, military commands, and administrative bodies that can adapt independently. This emperor understands that fear galaxy-spanning rule demands redundancy, because any single failure point, including himself, could doom everything. His authority remains immense, but it is exercised with restraint, knowing that fear may conquer worlds quickly, yet cooperation sustains them for generations. Mortality forces him to accept compromise not as weakness, but as survival logic, and the Imperium begins to resemble a vast, evolving organism rather than a rigid monument to absolute control. The creation of the Primarchs under mortal emperor takes on an entirely different meaning, because they are no longer designed as eternal extensions of a singular will, but as successors, rivals, and inheritors of responsibility. Each Primarch is raised not merely as a weapon or general, but as a potential future leader capable of independent judgment, disagreement, and adaptation beyond their creator's lifespan. This changes their relationships profoundly, replacing silent expectation with open debate, ideological conflict, and mutual accountability. The Emperor no longer positions himself as the unreachable center of their existence, but as the first among leaders, shaping them through mentorship rather than command alone. Some Primarchs thrive in this environment, developing philosophies of governance, diplomacy, and long-term defense, while others struggle with the burden of autonomy, no longer able to define themselves solely through obedience. Rivalries still emerge, but they are framed within political and strategic tension rather than destined betrayal. The seeds of rebellion are not planted through emotional abandonment, but through ideological divergence, creating conflicts that resemble civil wars of belief rather than catastrophic collapses driven by manipulation and resentment. As the crusade advances, its tone becomes less apocalyptic and more calculated, prioritizing sustainable dominance over overwhelming annihilation. Worlds are integrated through layered systems of defense, trade, and shared technology, reducing reliance on constant military occupation. The Emperor recognizes that endless war erodes humanity as surely as external enemies, and thus invests heavily in logistics, research, and cultural cohesion. Warp travel, while still dangerous, is approached with caution, protocols, and strict limitations that prevent reckless overexpansion. The Imperium grows slower, but stronger, with fewer fractures forming beneath its surface. This version of humanity does not assume inevitability. It assumes vulnerability and builds accordingly. Xenos' threats are confronted decisively, but not blindly, as intelligence and long-term containment strategies take precedence over scorched conquest. The galaxy remains hostile, but humanity learns to navigate it with patience rather than desperation. Without an immortal figure looming above all institutions, the collapse that defines the Horus Heresy becomes far less absolute, because power is already divided, contested, and resilient. Betrayals still occur, because ambition never disappears, but no single act threatens to shatter the Imperium entirely. Civil conflicts emerge as political struggles, regional rebellions, and ideological schisms, each dangerous yet containable. The Emperor's mortality prevents stagnation, because succession planning is embedded into the Imperium structure from its earliest days. When leadership transitions occur, they are painful but expected, chaotic but survivable. Humanity does not freeze itself in a single moment of trauma. Instead, it adapts, reforms, and evolves through crisis rather than collapsing beneath it. A mortal emperor approaches technology with pragmatism rather than paranoia, understanding that progress must be guided, not imprisoned. Scientific advancement continues under strict ethical oversight, preventing uncontrolled experimentation while avoiding total stagnation. Innovation becomes a strategic necessity rather than a forbidden risk, allowing humanity to respond dynamically to new threats rather than relying on relics of a forgotten past. The Imperium never becomes trapped in technological regression. Instead, it develops cautiously forward, maintaining relevance in a galaxy that never stops changing. Chaos remains a force of corruption and manipulation, but it no longer exploits a singular emotional fracture at the heart of humanity's leadership. Without absolute reverence or centralized obsession, its influence spreads slower and faces stronger institutional resistance. Education, psychological conditioning, and transparent governance reduce vulnerability to whispered promises of power and destiny. Chaos becomes a persistent war rather than an existential collapse, dangerous yet understood, feared yet fought with clarity instead of superstition. Culture flourishes in unexpected ways, because humanity is no longer defined by frozen myth, but by continuous reinterpretation of its past. Art, philosophy, and political theory evolve alongside military doctrine, producing a civilization that understands itself not as eternal, but as adaptable. The Imperium becomes a living story rather than a static legend, one that can learn from failure rather than deny it in the end. A mortal emperor creates something far more dangerous than eternal authority, a humanity capable of surviving without him. This future is not brighter, safer, or kinder, but it is resilient, flexible, and real. Humanity stands not because one figure endures forever, but because countless minds learn to carry the burden forward. And in a galaxy defined by endless war, that may be the most powerful weapon humanity ever forges.